Hola, ¿qué tal a todos? We are back with our final speaker of the day, third day of talks of CTO Summit 2020. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our next speaker. I'm very excited with this talk, coming all the way from Mexico and then connecting with Europe via the UK. I want to introduce our next speaker. She has an incredible background. She was a PhD candidate at the University of Manchester. Then she became a research software engineer at the University of Sheffield. And currently she holds the position as senior cloud developer advocate at Microsoft. But more importantly, I think the topic she's going to be talking about and sharing with us is one that me personally, I feel is fundamental, which is the inclusiveness and leadership in open source communities. We've all been experiencing the current polarization of society, not just here in Spain, in Europe, worldwide, basically. And it's becoming a very challenging situation. And one of the things that every single scientist always mentions is the need for more diverse communities, the need for more inclusiveness in all the groups of people collaborating together. And this is not something that escapes the tech sphere. And I would even argue that's even more dramatic in the technology sphere. So to talk about this, I want to welcome our speaker, our guest. Thank you very much for being here. Big virtual applause for Tania Allard. Un placer, Tania. Encantado. And the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Muchas gracias, Alex. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining for this session. This is a topic that I am very passionate about. And I talk about this quite a lot. As Alex very kindly introduced me, I am a developer advocate at Microsoft. And I know my title is very obscure, but in brief, my work focuses a lot on making developers' works better. Whether you are in industry or in academia, wherever you are, I go wherever you are and try to make better tools for you to optimize your work. I work a lot in the open source ecosystem, and I have been using, maintaining, and advocating for open source for about 10 years, probably a bit more. And I'm mostly within all things data. I absolutely love data. I work in the scientific computing ecosystem and in all of those things related to machine learning, AI, deep learning. These slides are public, so if you want to access them at a later time, there is this URL where you can go and find them. As I usually do, these are released under a 𝗀𝗃 BY license, so you're allowed to reuse, remix, adapt as long as the attribution is retained. So what are we going to talk about in this presentation? Going to give a bit of an introduction. First, we're going to be talking about the rise of open source and how has open source shaped the world where we live in. Then going to move on to diversity and inclusion, and mostly coming to a shared understanding about what I mean when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and inclusiveness. Inclusiveness is a term that is not as broadly spoken about as the diversity and inclusion. So I want to bring this into the conversation. We're going to then move on to open source sustainability, and the core of this is leadership, like planning for leadership, bringing in new leaders, and succession, because although we would like our leaders to stick around forever, that is something that doesn't happen. People need to move on. So let's get started with the rise of open source. And just to let this in is, and you go to your social media, you go to your news, whatever news you're using, your medical records, all those of you that have now, for example, tracing up for COVID, as we do here in the UK, also your bank, all of them, all of these applications, everything is using free and public code at a certain level. All of this is built on open source. Our mother society, everything from our hospitals to stock market, newspaper, everything runs on software, and not just software, but open source and free software. And one of the reasons why this happens is because free and open source software makes it exponentially cheaper and easier to build software. Because once we have software that other folks have built and refined and put it out there for us to use, the amount of coding that your teams or other developers has to do is greatly reduced because we are building on the work of others. Again, we don't have to invest on proprietary systems. We don't have to have marketing, compliance, developer teams working on our own frameworks. So that reduces greatly the costs. But another societal change and society impact that the emergence of open source software has brought up to life is that it has made it easier for people of all demographics to learn how to code. And in the long run, this makes technology much more accessible to the world. So on one side, open source not only has made it cheaper and easier to develop software and applications and solutions, and therefore is also responsible for the explosion of startups, it has also seen the rise of a very, very large number of initiatives that teach people to code. Whether these are children, teenagers, folks from underrepresented or underserved minorities, women, career switchers, and we've even seen some initiatives for folks that are in prison as an initiative to bring them back into society once they are released from prison. And some examples of this are probably organizations that you have heard of, like Women Who Code, Django Girls, Pyladies, Black Girls Code, Dev Bootcamp, and Resource Center. So far, I have mentioned free and open source a lot, and I would like to think that everyone knows what it is, but I don't want to assume. But something that has also happened to me as I speak and advocate for open source is that we sometimes need to revisit and refresh this knowledge to all be on the same page. Sometimes we have like an understanding of what free and open source software is, and it turns out that somebody else has a different definition. Let me start with the fundamental difference between free and open source. Very often when we say the word free, especially in English, people think about it doesn't cost anything. Rather, I don't have to pay for the software that I'm using, but in reality, free in software refers to a heavily contextualized phrase where free refers to a political freedom rather than the price. If we were to translate this into Spanish, it makes it so much clearer because instead of using the term free, we would use the term libre as opposed to gratis. And this helps a lot to separate this distinction. And this political stance and this political way of thinking comes from these four freedoms that are defined and defended by the Free Software Foundation. And basically, it allows us to first run the software for any purpose, study how the program works or how the code works, redistribute and make copies so you can help your neighbor or your community. And the fourth freedom is improve the program and release your improvements to the public so the whole community benefits. And this basically is what lies under the GNU license and a lot of people are familiar with. When we think about free software, this is exactly where our mind goes to. But something that I've encountered a bit less is that less people are familiar with the true essence of the open source definition. And the organization that takes care of this open source definition is the Open Source Initiative, and this is the core definition for or the canonical definition for open source. This builds on those 4 freedoms that I mentioned before. But for as a piece of software to be classed as open source, it has to meet these other 10 rules or these other 10 items, which is free distribution, source code has to be public, the derived works also have to be open, the integrity of the author source code has to be preserved, there should be no discrimination against persons or groups or field of endeavor, there has to be a distribution of license, and when it comes to license, the license must not be specific to a product, restrict other software, and also must be technology neutral. So if whenever you're working on a project or you are open sourcing one of your company's project, if it doesn't meet these 10 criteria under the open source definition, it is not open source. And the story, or like this history of open source and free software, although they both started from the same origin, it diverted when we coined the term open source. And open source, the open source culture and open source ecosystem moved more towards the development methodology of software, how this is built and how that is put out there for the public and distributed. Whereas the free software side of things is still much more on the political side and much more on the social movement and way of thinking on free access or libre access to software. So this is much more concerned with the ethics of the software intrinsic qualities. And it is both this ethical or social and political movement and the pragmatism derived from open source that has allowed us in great capacity to say that the world now runs on open source. Open source is everywhere. And some of the reasons is because, as I've mentioned before, it is cheaper to build because we don't have to have a separate full-time paid team in our company to support the development of proprietary software. It's easier to distribute. You can also copy very freely, modify your code. You can create your fork if you want to divert from the original development. You can contribute your changes upstream. It is also very flexible to customize. And this again comes to the ability of you diverting from the original source and create your own fork of a technology that will lead to a direction that you're more interested in. Open source gives employees more bargaining power as well. So that means that us as developers have a lot more flexibility to choose a job or move between jobs. Because by using or building an open source frameworks, you have transferable skills or a reusable set of skills that are valuable and highly desirable by more companies, instead of just focusing on proprietary, narrow-skilled set of tools. And in theory, and I'm just going to go to theoretically, open source also has the potential to be more secure and stable. And this comes from the theoretical standpoint that when a software project has a lot of active contributors, as well as a thriving community behind it, the code not only has more hands involved, but also more eyes checking for vulnerabilities, patching it on a daily basis or a monthly basis or like quite frequent basis. So the code should be less vulnerable to security flaws, disruption in service, because we have more people reviewing the code, looking for bugs and fixing any problems as they arise. And again, I'm saying theoretically because there are some instances in which this is completely unsustainable and we can't just go in that direction. So this is like a bit of a background and the importance and where we are at with open source and the importance, how it has shaped our world, more than just making software a technology more widely accessible. It has completely changed the way we think about software, acquiring new skills and developing new skills and workforce. And something that we cannot disregard when we talk about open source, especially because of their ethical and community standpoints, is diversity and inclusion. And here I want to raise the question whether diversity and inclusion is enough for our communities. Whenever we always hear diversity and inclusion together. We always hear D&I initiatives here and there. And the truth is, because this two always go hand in hand. First, diversity refers to attracting the people of diverse skills, backgrounds, and experiences to work together. And this not only gives us more skill sets, different ways of solving problems, and different ways of thinking. But if not done well, this can also bring a myriad of problems. And this is why inclusion is very important, because inclusion is the action or the processes of empowering them, not only bringing them together, but providing them an environment that brings the best of their combined skills, backgrounds, and experiences. So you're not just creating a boiling pot of diverse thoughts, skills, and backgrounds, but you're actually providing an environment in which everyone can be the better version of themselves and work as a better team. And a lot of the initiatives that tackle diversity and inclusion stop there. But there is something very, very important and like another step in the ladder that we can move towards. And that's inclusiveness. And at a small level, inclusiveness is the inclusion of groups or individuals who were previously excluded. This can be in your team, this can be in your community, in decision making, or in leadership. And one way to measure inclusiveness or how well your company or your community is doing in inclusiveness is by measuring the eligibility, opportunities, and involvement in decision making and leadership that these previously excluded groups now have. And a very, very good indicator of you having achieved inclusiveness is noticing that your members are working together and sharing rather than competing for resources or power and therefore undermining each other. And at a very top level, inclusion and inclusiveness might sound like the same thing. Inclusion, it is very, very much about the process by which a community values, includes, and involves the diversity to improve well-being. Where the inclusiveness is the outcome of the policies and actions undertaken in a diverse community. So inclusiveness is how well those processes and policies that you're putting in place are allowing folks to be empowered, are allowing folks to actually improve the well-being of your community. Also, inclusion aims towards providing access to community resources, whereas inclusiveness aims more towards achieving diversity in community leadership and decision-making. So when we think about inclusiveness, we are not just bringing folks in and giving them equal opportunities or equal community resources, but we are allowing them to move a few steps forward and become integral parts of our community, assume leadership roles, become decision makers that will then influence other folks and improve inclusiveness in the downstream processes. And it would be easy to say, well, open source includes or promotes a collaborative culture by default. It also ties very nicely with open access, which democratizes technological accessibility and engagement. But open is not inclusive by design. Open is open by design, open is public by design, and we do have to make an active effort to make it inclusive and aim towards inclusiveness. Inclusion and inclusiveness is an active working part of our community. And we all now know that we build on these 4 freedoms. We have these 10 items that relates to the pragmatism and how on what is open source or not. And we would imagine that as we rely on these 4 freedoms, we would transmit that into our community so that everyone is included. But despite all of these freedoms, despite all of this societal and ethical movement, our community is still accepting and is still witnessing things that works against our purpose. And these behaviors are not doing us any favors. For example, it is not untypical for some projects or maintainers to be horrible towards their contributors or community. There have been a lot of studies aggregating the different experiences of contributors or ex-maintainers of open source projects, and we very often hear narratives of this such, like, I no longer use or contribute to X community or open source project because the principal maintainer is like abrasive, like very, very rude, or folks tend to shield through this meritocracy banner, where they say, oh, well, it's just open source is a meritocracy. The only thing that matters is the code, but not really. There is still some bias against certain communities or contributions or members. And I wish I could say that this is an outlier, that like these stories are not common, but I've heard in a lot of places that open source has a reputation for being aggressive and not very inclusive. And there's also a pattern that we have promoted a lot in open source, where we write docs, but docs or the user experience in many pieces of free and open source software is optimized for the developers rather than the users. So these are also microaggressions in which we are setting some users away from our projects by not including them or not making them also first-class citizens. Our community is also known for having these tools or operating systems wars in which we decide to limit support for certain pieces of software or certain systems just because reasons. But when we are limiting ourselves to these tools or operating systems, we also limit the number of people who might use and eventually support free software. And all of these different stories and experiences point to a lot of areas within open source where we can do a better job at bringing others into the free and open source software world. And this is very, very, very important. There are many studies that when these members, especially members from minoritized groups, feel that they need to keep away from spaces or projects or interactions with folks within our community to avoid discrimination, they also experience isolation and can negatively affect their mental health. And this is why it's not uncommon that we see a lot of folks that are active maintainers of open source projects stepping away because they are burnout, because it's easier for them to step away from it, step away from the community or the project than being constantly harassed or being constantly victim of microaggressions. And this is something that happens at every level. A couple of years ago, I want to say 2018. Yeah, it was 2018. Anthony 𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃 from Quansight started doing this analysis of the inequality in leadership of the PyData community. And it was a very interesting analysis because he didn't look just at the contribution graphs, but also looked at the folks that are sitting in governance positions within some open source projects. And we can say that a lot of the projects are doing very, very bad when it comes to equality in these positions. And something that came up to light is that the projects that are doing much better in terms of equality at all levels, not just contributors, but also leadership, is because they are making a continuous active effort and commitment to be more inclusive towards their communities and their members. And this is a critical position for open source, because sustainability is the major concern in open source. On one side, open source heavily relies on volunteers or folks that do this because they truly believe in the free movement or because it is something that they love. A lot of people come in for the community and make a lot of friends. That is my case. One of the things that made me stay in open source is because I've met a lot of very, very good folks that have become mentors, that have become friends, that have been people that have allowed me to be where I am in my career. Also, it's not surprised that a lot of folks don't have strategic plans when it comes to diversity and inclusion and long-term sustainability, because many open source projects become too successful, and folks that are the core maintainers or the core developers are just thrown into leadership positions just per chance, without any prior training, without any prior plans, without any succession planning. So since we've already seen how diversity and inclusion may be a tipping point for sustainability, I want to introduce with this quote from 𝗂𝗂𝗃𝗂𝘀𝗶𝗃𝗃. She wrote an amazing report called Roads and Bridges, where she highlights a lot of the nuances of the software industry and the open source industry, where folks, before her report, a lot of folks and companies didn't really know how precarious the situation of the open source world was. A lot of people were absolutely shocked because they were using open source, but they never, and they have been participating in communities, but they never truly understood how much self-sacrifice and how much goodwill was actually keeping open source together. And since then, since this report emerged, that has been a massive flood or a massive rise of newly launched initiatives that aim to get funding to the hands of open source maintainers. I have put in this slide a few of these initiatives that go from Mozilla open source grants, that is a nonprofit, to other private initiatives like GitHub sponsors or Tidelift. But we've seen a lot of emergence of these initiatives over the last few years trying to help with the sustainability of open source. And it's great. It's great to see that both nonprofit and private funding is going into the pockets of open source maintainers. And truly, believe me, I am all up for paying the maintainers. I am all up for hiring folks full-time to work on a critical open source infrastructure. But sustainability goes way beyond money. Sustainability is much more than having millions of pounds or dollars to fund development. It helps a lot to pay the development time, but it's not going to create a truly sustainable, free and open source software ecosystem. What does truly make a sustainable ecosystem are these three items. First, contributing back, human and environmental diversity, and community safety. And when we think about contributing back, again, this is there are three pillars that you have for contributing back. Tiffany Faris from Drupal has done a very good job at summarizing what are the three main avenues to contribute back: time, talent, and treasure. I'd say if you have time, I'd say if you can volunteer your time, if you have that privilege of having extra time or extra cycles to actively engage and volunteer with open source project, that is great. You can also give your talent. And when it comes to giving your talent, it can be, if you are a company and you have specialists within your company, you can provide some of their expertise to contribute to open source. You can also help with organizing. If you, for example, have knowledge of licensing law, open source law, as well as other specific talents like community management, design, those are talents that are greatly appreciated. And yeah, of course, if you don't have the time or the talent or either, you can throw money. And that is a treasure. Sometimes we don't have money, but we can use other we don't have time, sorry, but we can use other avenues to get money to the pockets of orgs that are now contributing to open source. Now, when I've been I work a lot in terms of diversity for communities and projects.
Hello, Tania. We can't hear you.
A second.
There you go.
Oh, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yep.
There you go. Yeah. So when it comes to diversity, a lot of people say, I want to get more women in my conference, in my project, in my company. But diversity is not a flat binary. It's not a binary characteristic. We need diversity in people, in diversity in geography, in languages, in tools, in backgrounds. Especially when it comes to languages, I not only talk about programming languages, but coding and software is so tightly is like so tight with English that folks that come from not English speaking countries and that don't have the means to learn English before learning to code are facing massive barriers. There is not enough free educational content in all the other languages. And by that, we are really limiting the users and contributors that are located in many, many geographical areas, especially in those located in the global south. Now, when I talk about tools, like we have a growing monoculture. And let's start, like I love GitHub. I absolutely love GitHub. I use GitHub a lot, but GitHub is not entirely open source, and I'm not talking about the code base, all right? And I don't want also to say that it's going to be the end of open source, but I have a lot of friends in the open source ecosystem that are, on one side, incredibly grateful that GitHub has now all of these things like GitHub Actions and packages and discussions and now code spaces. But what happens when, on those few times a year where GitHub has infrastructure problems? What happens to open source software? A lot of projects come to a halt, right? What happens to all of those NPM modules that your company relies on, that you're trying to install from GitHub? Like you can't get access to this because we have a lot of our eggs in one basket. It's okay. What are we going to do to support and maintain the digital infrastructure? Right? We have to strengthen the way to link fiscal sponsors to open source and to our tools and infrastructure ecosystem. So we have to also come with alternatives to our monoculture, and it's healthy having more than one single solution for everything. Now, the third thing that we have to look in is community safety, and this is because community is an integral part of open source. Open source was born for the community and by the community. And I know this sounds like cliche and a very light-hearted sentence that is said too much. When you have a lot of folks using your software from all over the world, and eventually they decide to engage more with your community and they decide to participate and contribute, I already mentioned before that there are so many attitudes like belittling comments, directed criticism, sexualized language, racism, sexism. All of this still happens in open source software, and it's driving people away, like very talented and very humane people. When all of this happens, even if you have a code of conduct and you fail to enforce it, or you decide actively not to enforce it, because what happens if a very talented software developer leaves? All of these things undermines the trust required to build an open source community. If you don't have a healthy and a sustainable community, you're not going to have a sustainable project. And when this happens, all of these open source projects that us and our companies rely on will go again. It will just go away. And we all know how trust is very, very important in any team, like in any company, when we're working on any project. But it is especially important for open source projects. For so long as open source has existed, open source projects and open source teams have been globally distributed. In many cases, there are some maintainers that have never met each other except for mailing lists, video calls, or code bases. If you have certain behaviors that is undermining and breaking the trust between you and your community, it's going to be very, very hard to bring folks into those leadership positions. And their folks are not going to trust that you're going to be having their best interest and their safety and sustainability of your project at heart. So how are we going to plan for leadership and succession? We very often plan for, let's bring more contributors, let's bring more maintainers. But how often do we think what is going to happen when our leaders or core maintainers need to move on? Because life happens, right? Sometimes we have our benevolent dictators for life and they leave. But every project has many more roles than just a benevolent dictator for life. And we need to have a plan for when anything happens to these folks. And succession planning comes about establishing processes of identifying and developing new leaders. And listen, that I'm not just saying identifying and onboarding, but also developing leaders. Shall this need to happen? And again, any project role which is measured by a buzz factor. I don't know if you're familiar with a buzz factor, which is the number of the people in the team that, if run over by a bus, would put the project in jeopardy or would make the project come to a halt. So we have to start thinking about training and upskilling and mentoring those people in the skills required to step into critical roles and avoid our project from coming to a halt. And this is very important because the skills can be learned. And this is something that we all know very well in the tech world. Skills can be learned. And the speed at which we can acquire those skills is incredible now with all the free access that we have to technology and resources. So if skills can be learned and we can bring someone into this position, why would we even bother in writing a succession plan? Well, succession plans are important for continuity. If someone leaves a role, think about your company, let's say a leader in your company. If they just disappear, it not only leads to confusion and delays, but political woes for the project. If we don't have a succession plan or mechanisms in which we are creating new leaders or help alleviate all of these issues and confusion, nobody knows who's up next or why. Nobody knows who's empowered to take the leadership. And again, this helps avoid power vacuum. We are not only ensuring that there is continuity in the project, but again, we're also ensuring that folks can take time off, they can go on vacations without the project fumbling when they're not around. It also ensures that your project it ensures the project longevity because it reduces burnout of your project leaders by allowing everyone to collaborate and contribute, know where the project is going to, but also it reduces the pressure and load of your current leaders. So it's going to be a bit less likely that they're going to end up absolutely burned out and leave. If folks need to step down of the roles, if they need to move into other positions, if they need to take time off, it's fine. You have a succession plan. That means that your project is going to evolve, and it's going to survive instead of just dying and wilting. We can also plan for talent development. We talk a lot about mentoring people to contribute code. But we can also mentor people to become successors for critical roles, whatever your critical roles in your project are. Also, if you have a clear plan for develop these folks can feel inspired and they can have something to aspire to. If someone sees that there is a path to and a plan for leadership positions, it can mean that if they stick together, like if they stick around, it means that if they put the effort, their effort might be recognized and they will have something to step onto shall they want. It also gives an extra layer of confidence that the project has their stuff together. They know what they're doing. But also, when we're planning for successions, it's a great opportunity to bring folks with different ideas. And why doesn't it happen? Like why most open source projects don't have, or a lot of open source projects don't have this, is because, well, people are too busy, don't think of it, or don't want to think about. There are some not very nice attitude of current leaders, and people don't know where to start. Like even just thinking about, well, how do I find folks? How do I build all of this transfer? How do I build this plan? It's a very overwhelming activity, especially once you have a large project or a large community. It can be very scary. So how do you go about it? First, work in the open and not alone. In the spirit of open source, be clear about your governance and your succession planning. Ask for community feedback. Make sure that your other maintainers and even external advisors are on board, and put together a plan that folks can provide feedback on. Identify critical roles, and this is very, very important. Step one is to identify those roles in your project which make or break the project. Only you and your project can define what is critical to you. And this will be different for each project. Once we have identified the projects or the role, sorry, you need to be really, really honest with yourself and your community and understand and define the duties and responsibilities of those roles, as well as setting clear expectations. Setting clear expectations is critical because when someone steps into a role and then it turns out that they not only have to do their role, but take on other responsibilities because they are folks from minoritized groups or a certain other group, then you are not abiding by those expectations. At least what you think that the role should do, but also the duties that it actually performs. Step 3. Plan for knowledge transfer, onboarding, and offboarding. We very often think about how we're going to bring people into the project, but we spend very little time thinking about the offboarding, how we have to get someone out of the project because they're stepping out, because they are no longer interested in participating. Like, what knowledge should be kept and retained within your project or your organization? And things that need to be transferred are, of course, procedures and processes, resources, credentials. Like, I can't emphasize enough how many times credentials, nobody knows who has the credentials to access like social media or a Bolt or a tool or something. And also, folks forget to revoke credentials for folks that have left so very often. Project history is also something that is very important to keep because this gives a lot of items and it gives you the evolution of your project and your community. And you need to know this to plan how you're going to evolve this in the future. And all of this must be documented. You have to have clear documentation on how each of these 4 items are going to be transferred and the processes for transferring them. And when it comes to acquiring new leaders and contributors, we know that the first step, like we do with our company, is raising awareness. We can do this through blogs, conferences, social media. And then the second step is engaging, getting folks to contribute to the project, work with us. We do this with hackathons, sprints, and like other workshops, for example, webinars. And I've seen that so many initiatives stay there, like they raise awareness, they engage, and that is it. They expect that the rest of the magic will just happen by itself. You as a contributor, you as a maintainer, or as a leader, you have then the responsibility during those 2 previous processes, recognize potential leaders and actively invite them to the project. And then onboard them. Make sure that you are mentoring them, that they're probably shadowing the roles that they're being onboarded for, and more importantly, empower them. Empower them to start making decisions, empower them to be heard, and bring their skills in a meaningful way. And recognize contributors is a massive step into acquiring new leaders and onboarding them. Acknowledge their contributions and make sure to lay a path for them to progress within your project or your organization. If we adopt these practices of being very, very honest on identifying where our blockers are, where our leaders are, what critical roles, and create all of these steps with inclusiveness and diversity in mind, we can start tackling the main point of community or project sustainability, that is community sustainability and community safeness. And by doing this, we can start making things better. we can start getting better at not allowing those behaviors that are so damaging our open source, are gatekeeping open source by using tactics like meritocracy and such. And this is a phrase I just wanted to close my presentation with, is like the single biggest way to impact an organization or a project is to focus on leadership development. There is almost no limit to the potential of an organization that recruits good people, raises them up as leaders, and continually develops them. Thank you, folks. And if you have any questions, you feel free to reach out on taniaallard.dev at any time.
Okay, and we're back. Tania, thank you so much for your talk. As you guys say, not over there, but over back in the motherland, estuvo padrísimo. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really, I think it's very, very important to talk about these things, and you raised fantastic points. We actually have 2 questions, so let me read the first one from Javi, who says something like, diversity and inclusiveness metrics are nearly inexistent in the tech world and are mostly focused on gender diversity. How can leaders in the open source community change that?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. A lot of our metrics are focused towards gender. There are projects like Chaos that have been working over the last few years to come up with better metrics to measure sustainability and diversity in open source projects. I think something that we can start also, something that also biases a lot these metrics is the importance that we give to code contributions. We very often say that, well, a lot of folks don't openly say it, but they treat it so that code contributions are the most important contributions in open source. And those can be hardly measured if you go, for example, to GitHub and see the graphs and the commits. But what happens to all of the other contributions that are critical for the project sustainability and the community safety that are not measured through that? We have to start working and reframing the validity of and the importance of all of the contributions being equal. And then I think we can start thinking about how we measure like all of these contributions and have a better picture of our project diversity and inclusion. It's a long way. It's going to be a lot of work, and it's not easy. Yeah, it's so hard.
No, but I think you raise a very, very valid point. I've been working a lot with women in tech and around diversity and inclusiveness. I've written reports for the EU Commission around these things, and it is true that most of the metrics are lacking, and the reason why it's lacking is because of what you just said, is the way people measure things is already biased, because you give a lot of weight to things that don't include the different ways you can bring things to the table, basically. And I'll be honest, I've been guilty of that. Sometimes when I do mentoring with, for example, female entrepreneurs, I started realizing that the kind of aggressiveness that they perceive sometimes in the community is not something that as a man you fully grasp when you talk to other men. But when you talk with female partners is when you realize, oh, whoa, okay, maybe I'm not understanding that the way I'm talking, the way I'm putting things on the table is not the only way to say things, and it's definitely not the only way to enrich the conversation, to enrich the product, and to enrich the community. So I think it's very important what you just said. We have another comment from Bianca. She asks, can you share a good example of an organization with good inclusiveness? That's a tough one.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough. I'm going to go for an open source project. if you go to Interact, it's part of the Jupyter ecosystem. The Jupyter ecosystem is getting much better. Interact is amazing. They have a lot of like diversity in their leadership group, the leadership group, but they also do a lot of very nice small actions that when added up together, it really brings a truly inclusive outcome. Something else, another project that I truly love, and it's one of my favorite people in the world, is the Turing Way. That is led by Dr. 𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗃 at the Alan Turing Institute. And she works with 𝗲𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗃, and they too are amazing when it comes to diversity inclusion. And everything they do is inclusion first. How to bring folks from diverse backgrounds into the project and empower them to do stuff with it. So I truly encourage you to check those two projects. They have like different approaches, but both their approaches are very, very effective.
No, whoa, that's fantastic. I think that, and this is for everyone listening right now, the more we share this content, the more people hear about what you just shared with us here and engage with these projects, the better it's going to go for everyone. I'm a true believer on in the power of more diversity and more inclusiveness. It is, as you said, very tough. It has a lot of challenges also. In a way, it also forces you to redefine your own model of the world for a lot of people. And that's why it becomes very, very tough sometimes to deal with these things. Well, we are done on our side. By the way, while I was listening to you, I went to Nadia's website to check on the paper on open source communities that you mentioned. But she has, I don't know how many papers. I'm just looking at her page right now here. She has 2 books, 2 podcasts, 4 guides, 2 sets of data sets. I don't know how many talks. So afterwards, I'm going to ask you exactly which one were you mentioning, because there's a lot of stuff here.
Oh,
but I would
Roads and Bridges.
Growth. Let me check. Growth.
Roads and Bridges.
Oh,
like
roads.
Caminos y Puentes.
Yeah. Oh, I got it here.
Yeah.
She has it as a book.
That
okay.
is so good. I think it's like 140 pages, but it's super good. It's well worth it.
It's called Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Labor Behind Our Digital Infrastructure, July 14th, 2016. Great. Good. Well, Tania, it was an absolute pleasure. Very, very honored for having you. As I told you before, estuvo padrísimo. Muchísimas gracias, Tania, por tu esfuerzo, por la charla. It was super well designed, super structured, very, very nice. So I really appreciate that. And with this, I'm going to say goodbye to you, Tania, and we're going to start closing. Again, muchísimas gracias, Tania. Ten un buen fin de semana. Pásalo súper bien.
Muchas gracias, Alex. Gracias por haberme invitado.